Welcome. I'm Jeremiah Reiner, and this is the Deeply Rooted Podcast. Hey there, welcome to the Deeply Rooted Podcast. This is episode 135, and on this episode, we're going to actually be looking at a recent situation down in New Orleans, Louisiana, as the Southern Baptist Convention has met and concluded their annual meeting, and we're going to be looking at an update on the SBC, and for that reason, we've brought in Brother Travis Hilton. He's the pastor of Crystal Spring Baptist Church in Roanoke, Virginia. Travis is a graduate of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and along with his wife, they're the proud parents of two grown children. He's been on the podcast before. You can go back and find that in our archived episodes. It was actually episode 129. So we talked a lot about Travis's life and ministry. And if you go back and check that out, you'll find out one of the great things about Travis. He is a Scott County, Virginia native and a graduate of Gates City High School. So we want to give a big shout out to all of our Blue Devil listeners. I know we've got some alumni and some students I know that listen. I have heard that. So shout out to all you Blue Devils out there. And Travis, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, Jeremiah, it's great to be back with you.
I know they'd probably want to ask for your PALS order. We'll get to that later for all those insiders.
Yes,
but
yes, please.
We'll go ahead and get into topic. And we talked about this before we got on. We're going to be dropping a lot of names and terms and probably institutions that may be somewhat foreign to our audience. So we will do our absolute best as we walk through this conversation here and catch people up to speed on the Southern Baptist Convention, what it is, and the terms and people we might be mentioning. So hang tight with us as we get into the conversation. I promise you we'll do our best to keep you filled in. But we want to start off really simply with a question here. What is the Southern Baptist Convention, and how long has this been in existence?
Well, that's a good question, because to understand even how this group, some people call it a denomination, but it's not a denomination in the standard description of that word, and that's why it's important to understand. The Southern Baptist Convention itself has been in existence since 1845, and even before that, there was a more national convention called the Triennial Convention, which existed for missions, for the cooperation of Baptist churches in sending missionaries. So that existed before then. And so it seems like there's always been a cooperation of churches. Going back to England, 1600s, there's been associations of churches that had a common confession of faith, even though they were autonomous and independent in their governing of themselves and self-governance. And so we say that to say, by the time we get to 1845, there is an issue of slavery. There's division in the country. You're beginning to see the fissures, and that shows itself in an unfortunate way that the SBC is founded, and yet there are foundations of believing the gospel and sending missionaries and being together in cooperation to do that together in those early days. So that was the beginning with the Southern Baptist Convention. And so they've always been, churches within this convention that had strong biblical convictions, and there's always been a guiding confession of faith. Churches themselves have maybe varying degrees of what they believed in some sense, even though they still all believed in the same orthodox understanding of the gospel and those things. So there's always been different even movements within Southern Baptist life, and we'll probably talk about some of that as we go along. But before there was a Southern Baptist Convention, there were independent Baptist churches that govern themselves. And that's the part we need to remember. Every church that's a part of the Southern Baptist Convention are self-governing. There is no authority by any body within the Southern Baptist Convention that governs the independent these churches in what they do. So that's important to understand off the top, because sometimes when people think there's a decision made by the Southern Baptist Convention, that it's from the top down.
Yeah.
But there are messengers sent to the convention who make major decisions. These messengers come from all of these churches, and every church that gives to the Southern Baptist Convention is able to send these messengers. And the purpose of what they make decisions on are about cooperation in missions, basically, and how that they serve the institutions that they've created for the sake of the gospel. And we can get into all those different entities that exist within the Southern Baptist Convention, but hopefully that's helpful to understand. And today the common confession of faith that is shared with Southern Baptist churches would be the Baptist Faith and Message 2000.
Right. How large is the convention today? How many churches, off the top of your head, do you think are right now belonging to the SBC?
Well, I wish I had the exact number, but you always hear a number like 40,000, something like that. But give or take, there's a lot of church planting going on. So sometimes you hear of increases and decreases. There are churches that shut their doors every year. So there's a bit of fluctuation. And I think through COVID, some smaller churches really took a hit. So we've heard of some churches, increase in folding, and so I'm not for sure where that number stands right now.
Having said that, if we use the loose definition of denomination, and I know you mentioned earlier it's usually considered the largest Protestant, quote-unquote, denomination in the world. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, Protestants, yes.
Yes. Right. Yes. So we're talking about a large group here. So I want everybody to understand that. So when we say the SBC, this is something that encompasses the nations. This is not an American group. So we want to establish that. There are SBC churches literally around the world. So when we talk about this entity, we're talking about a large body here, as you had mentioned, coming together underneath the heading of the Baptist Faith and Message. And to catch everybody up to speed on what we really want to dig into here on the episode, over the last decade or so, briefly explain to our audience what has been going on and made things so rocky and divisive within the Southern Baptist Convention.
Well, depending upon how far you want to go back, and some people they don't really want to hear anything past maybe 2 years ago, but you really have to understand things in a context. Like I went back to 1600s there for a minute, and that I hope that didn't cause someone to start to lose interest, because it's really important to understand those things. Right. We're not Johnny come lately as far as our beliefs, but the issues started, we could say, back even in the 1960s, early 60s, because there was liberalism creeping into the Southern Baptist Convention, into the seminaries. And we currently have 6 seminaries. Had 6 seminaries in the early 60s, but it was discovered that there was teaching that was contrary to our confession of faith, which was then the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message.
Right. And
some of that, there was some wiggle room, we'll say, in some of what happened. And going into the 60s and into the 70s, some professors were accused, and some even owned up to what we call double speak. They would say one thing with their theological terminology, but mean another. Mm. And they got away with a lot that way. But it became a realization when studies were done on the students that were coming out of the seminaries that there were fewer believing basic things about theology, like the virgin birth, about the reality of a real judgment in a literal hell.
Yeah.
Things like that. There was a lot of those things that were starting to become obvious, that the product from those institutions was we were, and it was affecting churches, because those are the people going into the churches and preaching in the churches, and so it's making churches more liberal in their beliefs ultimately. So that was the effect. So the determination that there needed to be a change. So that's when the conservative resurgence began, really in earnest in the late 70s. And that took a strong commitment on the part of many local pastors of small churches and church members to realize that they had to show up at the Southern Baptist Convention to bring about change. And that was a commitment of many years, because how things happen is that convention presidents are chosen, and those presidents are involved in appointing committees, nominating committees, a committee on committees, and those committee on committees, it sounds complicated. They choose the trustees that are going to serve in all of the entities, all of the seminaries, and on the mission boards, the North American Mission, now called the North American Mission Board, and the International Mission Board. So it's important that the decisions are made on who's in leadership, so that would trickle down, we might say, to the other entities, and that those people would be committed to seeing about change, so that the right people would be in place to teach and train people for ministry and missions, to be missionaries. So that was what happened over 20 years. It took 20 years for there to be a comprehensive change in the Southern Baptist Convention. And so, it was good. And I'm a product of that. By the time that I went to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, that change had taken place there, and it was almost like a revival happening there in the late 90s when I came, and the teaching was solid, and that happened at all the other seminaries as well. And I should have mentioned also what was called the Sunday School Board, now Lifeway.
Okay,
was also at that time there was a big change that took place there as well.
Some of the more recent issues, you mentioned that there was a conservative resurgence, some pretty popular names during that time helping spearhead that. You'll hear a lot of people talk about Adrian Rogers and different folks, and we don't have time to really go into some of those presidents, but very faithful men. He was not the only one, but many, like you said, local churches standing in the gap there, so to speak, and helping spearhead that as they shifted back towards a much more biblical foundation, as you mentioned, bleeding over into the seminaries, and then ultimately really out to the local churches. But as we've seen, the drift has come back, and so there are newer divisions now that maybe not necessarily what they were fighting back during the conservative resurgence, but as you mentioned, the key word there, a strong drift back to liberalism, which has a lot of different facets to it. So real quickly, some of these things that have came up, what would be the more modern liberalism drift here for the SBC?
Some of the issues that have recently cropped up that we've seen.
Yes.
I think that one of the big ones that it started to become a realization about 3 years ago was CRT,
right.
Critical race theory. There were complaints that, and a resolution that was passed that had that language in it. And resolutions don't really hold any sway other than it's almost like a marker. It's almost like a post, like we are affirming this or something that we might believe strongly, but it doesn't have any weight as far as any bearing on any institution, but it's something that can be referenced. And so there was alarm when something was passed about 3 years ago pertaining to critical race theory that you probably heard a lot about in the news and some news outlets, and the concern for that in our education system and so forth, and how that undermines I would say, legitimate concerns about racism.
Right.
From a biblical perspective that we should have when recognizing that racism is sin, but the reinterpretation of what racism is through this lens of CRT. We don't, as you were saying, we're being very brief with these things, but that was a big issue,
yeah.
And there's other ones that we're going to talk about in a minute, but also related to abuse cases. Mm-hmm. And how that those are interpreted and how that those are dealt with has become an issue. And I don't think that that's fully resolved. I mean, there's decisions that have been made that I think have caused some pain for the convention because of the way that the decisions were handed down and the way that the people that were brought in to make an assessment of these things. So, and again, it's not to say that we shouldn't do anything. I think that the people that have been consulted and the way that, and even an agency outside of the Southern Baptist Convention that called Guidepost, who obviously has very secular underpinnings and things that they advocate for. It's come out that, even just things that they would put on social media that obviously showed that they had an allegiance toward LGBTQ issues.
Right.
And that obviously becomes a concern when, who are you putting your trust in to make an assessment of these things?
Yeah.
Legitimate concerns about how that we, as the Southern Baptist Convention, Convention of Churches, how we would even begin to deal with these issues. So those are two big ones, I think, that have caused a lot of contention and concern.
Yeah, some of the other ones, just to piggyback on that, because like we said, that's not the only two. There are other things that have been popping up that people have been concerned about. There's been some spending talk, some plagiarism and trust issues from the top. I know that was mentioned over the last couple of years, particularly at the presidential level, sadly. And then you also have what we'll talk a lot about in this instance, the complementarian and egalitarian debate, and we'll look at that in a moment. And we will define those terms, I promise you, for our audience, because I know those are a little on the deep end of theology, but I do believe that most of our listeners will understand that once we begin to break those down. So those, again, just a few that we're looking at there. And another point to be made, because of this, and I don't think surprisingly, there have been many churches that are starting to disassociate. And you've seen a little bit of movement over that over the last few years of churches disassociating with the Southern Baptist Convention, and whether they become independent or getting into another network or denomination of churches. Do you see that drift continuing, or do you think that might slow down over the next few years?
I think in some ways we're seeing some leaders recognize that there's a need for a major course correction. And I think that was reflecting partially in the last meeting in New Orleans. Some of the decisions that were made, I think that there's been an awareness, and sometimes it takes time. When you're talking about a big body, we've already talked about how many churches there are, and all of those don't show up for these conventions.
Right.
But just for instance, at the last convention, there were a total of 4,423 churches that were represented by the messengers, and they sent 12,737 messengers. That's a large these days. That's a large convention. Now, back in the conservative resurgence, now you visualize this, Jeremiah, 40,000 people.
Wow.
In a convention. Now, we can't even comprehend. I read the stories, and I think about that many people showing up to vote for something.
Right.
That's how serious they were about bringing about change. So for this day and time, 12,737 is a considerable number for these things. So we were thinking about these issues. People are showing up, and I think there's an awareness that there's some things that need to be addressed, but it's not always easy, because people are easily swayed one way or another, even the ones that they may have some basic solid convictions about things. But then somebody who's an influential speaker shows up and says something, and they applaud like they agree with everything they're saying, even though they may not, if they really start thinking about what this person's representing. And we have to bring up Rick Warren. Is it okay to bring up Rick Warren right now?
Yeah, we can get into that because that's where I was headed next. And really just feeding into that, we've sort of caught everybody up to speed on the issues, but now we need to get into the nuts and bolts of it because, as you mentioned, just coming off the heels of their most recent annual meeting, and we've mentioned the fact that they met in New Orleans. This was around the 11th, 12th, 13th-ish there of June. There was a lot on the table, and there was a lot to be decided. There was a lot of talk coming into that because sides were taken, and some very high-profile individuals and churches were on the front lines of that. And you've alluded to one of those right now. One gentleman in particular, pastor, or I guess technically former pastor now, of Saddleback Church in California, Rick Warren. Explain really quickly to our audience who Rick Warren is and why Saddleback Church is so influential.
Well, Rick Warren first became known for his book, Purpose Driven Life.
Right.
Followed by his book, Purpose Driven Church, in which he reflected on mainly what he had done in Southern California in the planting of Saddleback Church and the way that he had organized that church. And so he, this became like a model for a lot of churches that were planting, or maybe a church doing what we call today a revitalization. And it really, for people that don't know, if you were a pastor of an average Southern Baptist church, you got, before internet became so prevalent, you got stuff from Rick Warren in the mail telling you this is the way to do church. This is the way. This is going to build your church, grow your church.
Right.
And some things in that book, if you read that book, let's say Purpose Driven Church, there would be things at the beginning that would be true, like, it's not about you. We would all agree with it's not about us, right? It's about God. And it started off, that part sounded right. But the more you got into the book, and this was always the thing that made me scratch my head, even though, again, it wouldn't mean that everything was bad in the book, but it was more about the person. It was more about the Saddleback Sam, who was going to be the person you were reaching out to. It was more about what pleases Saddleback Sam than what pleases God. Right. And that was what was problematic about it. Some things, again, it wasn't heretical, but it just wasn't. It became the model for a lot of pastors, which is why that he continues to have influence. And he's just a likable guy. I mean, I've met him before. He gave me a bear hug. Nice guy, but he's just wrong. Right. And he's getting more wrong as we're going to talk about. He's way off now. So he's changed. He's already had another revelation that he realizes that he was wrong for 43 years on women in ministry, and that's where you're going.
Yeah, I was going to get into that because the whole point of him showing up and really coming into the whole forefront of the SBC conversation was some things that has happened over the last couple of years. He's made some heavy statements publicly and at the convention itself and on his own social media, and it really deals with the idea of who is a pastor, or what is a pastor, I guess would be the question that would be defined. And he has taken a very different stance than the SBC has historically taken, and frankly, let's just be honest, all Orthodox Christians for the last 2,000 plus years. He is not the only one. I want to make sure that we get this correct here. Fern Creek Baptist Church, along with Saddleback Church and Freedom Church, were also put up here for disfellowship this past meeting. Walk us through what happened there and why there was such a big debate between their definition of pastor and the SBCs, and really, again, Orthodox Christianity in general.
Where to begin?
Well, let's start here. Define
Yeah.
complementarian and egalitarian for us really quickly, and I think we might be able to launch from there.
Sure. Well, I think that when you look at the word complementarian, thinking about what it means for a man and a woman in a marriage, particularly, how God has designed marriage, how He's designed man and woman in marriage to serve one another in those roles. And if it's okay for me to just read briefly from the
Sure.
Southern Baptist Confession 2000, just to remind us of this. I'm going to read the third paragraph. The husband and wife are of equal worth before God, since both are created in God's image. The marriage relationship models the way God relates to His people. A husband is to love his wife as Christ loved the church, and he has the God-given responsibility to provide for, to protect, and to lead his family. A wife, here's the controversial part for some, a wife is to submit herself graciously to the servant leadership of her husband. And by the way, this is quoting basically from Ephesians, what's being said here.
Right.
The wife, I lost my place. A wife is to graciously submit herself graciously to the servant leadership of her husband, even as the church willingly submits to the headship of Christ. She, being in the image of God, as is her husband, and thus equal to him, has the God-given responsibility to respect her husband and to serve as his helper in managing the household and nurturing the next generation. So that's controversial for some, but if you're serving in a Southern Baptist Convention church or church that's cooperating, friendly cooperation, you're going to recognize that on some level, and that's what a complementarian would acknowledge is male headship in that role, which also translates to the church,
Right.
and understanding of spiritual leadership in the church, and how God has designated roles within the church for both men and women, and specifically men in the role of pastor, as we read in the scriptures. And we can look, and we'll talk probably more in a moment from 1 Timothy chapter 3. So that's complementarianism. And then there's egalitarianism. And there's different views and spectrums on that. Even, and I'll say this for complementarianism, there's probably, we could say the same. There's a spectrum of views, and some
Sure.
people that emphasize some things more than others. But with an egalitarian view, there's just no difference in the roles. It seems that everything is just like just a straight line, and no recognition of the differences between male and female in the specifics, that how God has created them for these roles. And I don't want to misrepresent egalitarianism, but there again, there are extreme examples of it, and then there's less extreme. But it seems to be infused with a lot of influence from feminism,
Right.
and that's the problem with that view. It really it seems to be a product of the culture in so many ways.
Having said that, and you did a great job explaining that, the three churches that we had mentioned, Saddleback, Fern Creek, and Freedom Church, had in fact violated that Baptist faith and message, and again, basic Christian understanding of roles by adopting and ordaining female pastors in their church. Of course, Warren tried to defend this, as did the other churches. He obviously kind of taking the lead on this because, as you had mentioned, a very, very famous man. I mean, there's no getting around that in any way, shape, and form. He is widely known by a lot of audiences. He carries a big following himself. And so in speaking up against that, it sort of felt like two major opposing forces here on this subject. And so Warren, Saddleback, Fern Creek, and Freedom began to defend their position as to why they thought that it was right and proper for them to be able to do that, and was looking for the SBC basically to go along, and that just simply was not the case because they were disfellowshipped. They did take a strong stance against that and found them to be, and this is the terminology that was used, and you had already alluded to it, they were not within friendly cooperation. And so as they got down to New Orleans, it was basically to finalize the resolution that these churches will not be in friendly cooperation and fellowship any longer with the SBC, and they were given the microphone. And of course, Warren had been on Twitter and every other platform you could imagine, already kind of trumpeting his stance on this, and shows up to the convention. We're not going to play that for you, but I would say this. You can easily find that online. You only get 3 minutes, and he went the full distance because they actually cut him off on the microphone before he completely finished. So for sake of you understanding that, though, please, listener, go online, find that. You can find plenty of clips on that on YouTube and hear his position. But there was an opposition, and they were given time as well, the SBC, and their spokesman at that time would have been Al Mohler, in which Dr. Mohler gave his defense as well on behalf of the SBC. Was he a part, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is he representing the executive committee in that role?
He was.
Okay. I wanted to make sure I got my terms right. So Dr. Mohler's not just speaking for Dr. Mohler. I want people to understand that he is speaking on behalf of the SBC and giving a rebuttal to that. And again, he only got 3 minutes. He did stay within his time, and I highly encourage our listeners to go back and listen to that as well. I thought he did an excellent job, and you can listen to both. The vote did come down. Your thoughts real quickly on both men's speech.
Well, Warren knows how to try to appeal to people's emotions, and he personalizes things. And I guess I don't want to mix up between what he said in California at the convention there and this one, but he spent a lot of time when he spoke in California. The first time they gave him an opportunity, he talked about everything that he had done, and it was astronomical numbers,
right,
that he claimed that he had, he had trained in the ministry and all of these things, which I would find impossible for anyone to account for.
I think he actually mentioned that he had trained more pastors than the SBC seminaries combined. I mean, I think that was the lingo that he used, which I thought was outrageous. But again, like you said, I mean, how would anybody know that number? And he's simply playing on emotional strings. But sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, but that was the point there. He really didn't say a whole lot. That I think that also everything leading up to the convention, I was just looking at a quote, and I'm not trying to get off track here from what you're asking me, but I was just looking at a quote that I had from a conversation that he had with Russell Moore. This is what's problematic about his what he's come to the conclusion on. This is what I was looking at a couple of places here.
And just for our audience, Russell Moore, can you explain who that is for everyone?
Russell Moore, the former president of the Ethics and Religious, the committee that represents Southern Baptists in ethics and ERLC.
Yeah.
So Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. He had served in a prominent role as president there, and before that he taught at Southern Seminary. And it seemed like his views just evolved as things have changed, in society over the last, particularly the major changes in the last 4 years. And it became more of a strain that he was pushed out in that role there at ERLC.
Now, you had mentioned the quote there. You were talking about who Russell Moore is, and explain what Warren said there that was so interesting, and why leading up to that was a pretty hot take.
Yeah, this is something that he's been repeating, but the first time that I heard it was on this podcast with Russell Moore, and this is what he says. Who authorized women to teach? Jesus. And he quotes, all authority is given to me, therefore teach. All authority is given to me, therefore baptized. You got a problem with the Great Commission. I had to repent when I actually looked at the Great Commission. I had to say, it's not just for ordained men. It's for everybody. That's his take. He basically saying, and he has said this over and over, and I think he did say this in his address. He has said it publicly on Twitter and other places, that he repents that for 43 years he has not recognized this. And that now all of a sudden, because of the Great Commission, that now he's looking at the role of men and women differently in the pastoral role. And so what had happened at his church was that a year and a half before, they had ordained 3 women to pastoral ministry. And one that's responsible for one of those campuses. So one of the satellite campuses of Saddleback Church. So when Al Mohler gave his response, which in a way, I'm sorry I don't have the quote, but Warren had somehow referred to something I think that Mohler had said previous, but in another setting. But Mohler responded and he tried to just keep things focused on what the issue was at hand, the fact that there is now a pastor serving one of the Saddleback campuses, and that it's not an issue of Mohler's interpretation. It's not, because that's what Rick Warren was emphasizing in this interview. He said something somewhere else that we always heard liberals and moderates for years talk about, well, it's your interpretation.
Right.
I have my interpretation and you have your interpretation and so forth. But he's basically saying this is not my interpretation of the Baptist faith and message or anything else. This is actually the convention's interpretation. This is collectively what they've affirmed that they believe. And that pretty much settles it. It's not about what Al Mohler thinks, but the fact that collectively these churches say this is what we believe the role of a pastor should be, and that was really what was at issue, and why that overwhelmingly that Rick Warren that his appeal did not pass, and it was an appeal. The decision had already been made,
right,
that they were disfellowshipped, but this basically sealed it.
Yeah, I want to read the numbers here for everybody. The vote came just right after that, and so here's the actual specific numbers from the SBC convention in New Orleans. So once Warren and Mohler were given their opportunity to speak, the voting breakdown went like this, and all 3 churches, by the way, were given individual votes. So let's make clear on that. Saddleback was, again, affirmed as being disfellowshipped, 88.46% to 11.36%, which I'll be personally honest, and maybe you can disagree with this, I don't know. I was surprised at how strong the vote was. I did think that the SBC messengers would continue the disfellowship. I was actually surprised at how overwhelming the number was there. So the disfellowship numbers was basically 88% of the messengers did agree that they must disfellowship with Saddleback. For Freedom Church, it was actually stronger, 96% to 3%, a little over 3%. And then for Fern Creek, again, over 90, it was 91% for them to be disfellowshipped compared to 7.63%. that stood by them. Are you surprised by those numbers, encouraged by those numbers? What do you think about that?
I am encouraged by those numbers.
Yeah. Why?
Because I think it reflects that there is still a strong consensus about what we believe about those things.
Right.
And again, there's a spectrum, even among those that are complementarian. And it's obvious when you hear some pastors speak. Some are stronger than others in their beliefs of how this is applied in cooperation, and we'll get into that in a moment.
Yeah.
But yes, there is an understanding that this is something that if we're going to cooperate, well, there's some things, but basically we've got to understand about leadership and spiritual leadership. So there's that is encouraging. And yes, I think that what we heard when Rick Warren spoke in California, he got a standing ovation,
right,
for his appeal. So I think some people were worried, but I wonder just how much of that was empathy, because again, he appealed to what he thought that he had done. And when you're in a crowd like that, and I've noticed it time and again, when some preachers get up, and if they're a good speaker, even when they're just not really preaching exegetically from the scriptures, there will be people that just think they're just so awesome and they'll clap.
Right.
But when a decision like this comes down, I think some people realize what's at stake.
Yeah.
And they have to come down with the right decision.
Do you think geography played as big a role in it as people were saying? You mentioned that they were in California last year. Obviously, that's right in his backyard. And California, let's just be frank, is far more known for being left-leaning than a Louisiana or really any state in the South for that matter. I don't think it was surprising there would be more conservatives to show up at New Orleans. Do you think that the vote in New Orleans is more indicative of where the SBC stands, or more where Southern SBC messengers and churches stand?
Well, I think you got a point about his influence in California.
Yeah.
Obviously. And I talked to brothers out there. They're very strong in their convictions and don't agree with him. But still, they're in close proximity, and I think that sometimes that affects your view of someone. So yes, I think it probably did a little bit, even though I do think that there are Southern Baptist pastors and leaders out there that do have still have strong convictions. And
sure.
And I say, having been in Wisconsin, they're very conservative, and they're at least I know in Wisconsin, Minnesota, for the most part, there's if you're going to choose to be, this is the other side of that. If you choose to be a Southern Baptist, as far as your affiliation, even though we know there's different brands of Southern Baptists, which we can talk about, it's a big convention, it's a big tent. But if you're going to choose to do that in a state where it's not as popular to be affiliated with them because of conservative convictions, there's something to be said for that. I think that, I don't know if that always is a factor, but it probably was, because they were in California and a lot of people couldn't make it out there as they came to New Orleans.
Yeah. And again, we don't want to do a disservice, as you mentioned, to our brothers in California. Not everybody there clearly is on the liberal side of things. And like you mentioned, you're in good contact with some that are certainly opposed to that and trying to remain faithful to the scriptures. Having said that, another vote that was interesting, obviously they were voting on the president again this year, and the previous president, Bart Barber, would retain that title and position. He actually won somewhat overwhelmingly. 68% of the vote went for him, whereas Mike Stone, who was getting the second leading percentage there, he came in with about 31%. So that's back-to-back years that what many people would refer to as the conservative candidate has lost out. Give you thoughts on that after especially seeing the voting towards Saddleback and Fern Creek and Freedom, and then seeing the vote there between Stone and Barber?
It is interesting why that would be the case. I think everybody will have their take on this.
Sure.
This is just like politics, and unfortunately, there is a little bit of politics in this, a little bit of politics in the Southern Baptist Convention. Wherever there's people, there's politics. So I think that there's several things, and some of this is just observable. Bart is a personable person. I'd mentioned earlier about Rick Warren, and if you've ever met him, right, he's very he's never met a stranger. I think Bart is the same way. I've known Bart. Met him at the convention, knew him before that online, and Bart just has a personality that's likable. I'd say that about Bart.
Yeah.
And doing these fun videos from his farm, and he's a small church pastor out there in Texas, and I think for some people that's disarming, right? And so just on that personal connection, Bart would say that he is complementarian. He would say that he believes in the inerrancy of the Scriptures. He would say all of these things. And so I think for some, they don't see that there's a danger in him continuing, because there's this tradition that if you are voted in as SBC pastor 1 year, the second year is almost an assumed. And traditionally, there are very few exceptions.
Right.
Where someone does not receive that second term, that second opportunity, we want to call it that. And so it would have been, that alone would have almost been like we do have some people that have empathy in the Southern Baptist Convention, I think. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad in this situation, but there's something even more that listeners may not know. 2 days before the convention, Barber's mother passed away.
Right.
And he even integrated that into his message. He had the SBC president as an opportunity to preach, and he mentioned her a couple of different ways in his message. And I have to say that was touching.
Sure.
And I think that those things, and probably some more intricate things, caused the vote to go his way this time. So for what it is, I don't know if Bart has a sense of urgency about some things that some of us have been concerned about in the same way, even though he may recognize it. I think he recognized the concern about Rick Warren and others. But the question is where to go from here.
Sure.
And we recognize that there are churches that are not in line with the Baptist faith and message. What do you do? And I think that's where we are with things. What do you do, and how do you do it? And there were some things that were obvious going into the convention that Bart was not in favor of, and you'll probably get into that.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of breaking that down. I wasn't really surprised with that vote. Like you said, historically, you could have almost seen that coming. Usually the second term there is pretty obvious, unless something is just outlandishly egregious. Or simply somebody may not be up to the task, obviously, and may not want it themselves. However, I'm not totally shocked by that number. And as you mentioned, now we're going to probably find out more about Barber as president. I think that second term is usually the meat and potatoes of it. And that leads me to this next question, because coming off of the heels of the disfellowship of those three churches, there was a lot of talk about how do we maybe prevent this in the future, maybe a way to put that. And there was an amendment proposed. This is something that had been circulated very publicly. As a matter of fact, I remember you and I briefly touching base about this once, and I want to drop the gentleman's name, Mike Law, who has been the one that I guess would be the one we would say spearheaded this amendment for the Baptist faith and message, and explain to our audience what his amendment proposal was and how would that change the Baptist faith and message as far as the wording and interpretation of what he was trying to get amended?
That's a really good question. And I'll say this about Mike Law. Mike Law is a friend of mine. I knew him in ministry when I was in Northern Virginia. Godly man, young man compared to me now. but he has strong convictions. By the way, his father was a missionary in Turkey, and mother. So strong convention ties.
Still in Virginia, correct?
Still in Virginia, pastors in Arlington, Virginia. But this proposal, actually, your question about how it affects the Baptist faith and message, it doesn't. It actually just enforces it, because
this pertains a good point.
This pertains to the Constitution, not the Baptist faith and message, which is our confession, but the Constitution, which would enforce those things within the Baptist faith and message. So we understand the difference. So there was a paragraph that he had proposed a year ago to read, "A church is in friendly cooperation with the convention," and I'm just paraphrasing this, "which affirms, appoints, or employs only men as any kind of pastor or elder as qualified by Scripture." That was the goal, to just be very clear about the biblical role of pastor and what that means. And so I hope that's clear. There wasn't anything to change. A confession of faith a lot of times is utilized in a general way.
Right.
And sometimes you have to be careful not to be specific about every nook and cranny. And there are other documents that cover things that need to be, we might say, enforced or understood more clearly. And so that didn't change anything in that was not meant to change anything in the Baptist faith and message. And actually something else you'll talk about in a minute might change that. But this was clearly which will take another year for it to be enacted. And there were some people who were uncomfortable with the wording, had some other ideas, and came around at the last minute to go along with this, and that's a good thing. Some different groups represented that decided, and some well-known pastors that there was some wording that they changed, and I'm sorry I don't have all that wording in front of me, but it just changed it slightly, improve it, and that always happens when you're in a body like this. There's amendments that are made
right
on the floor, but they were all in friendly agreement, and so that passed, to the chagrin of some people that have more of a feminist view of these roles, and so there's been some complaints about that, but it did pass.
Now, will this be? You mentioned it won't take effect till next year. Will that have to be re-voted on in next year's meeting to confirm that?
That's my understanding.
Okay, so basically
Yes.
They have received it as a proper amendment, and really giving everyone the year to look over it and then affirm that amendment coming up in next year's meeting. Where is next year's meeting, if you don't mind me asking? I don't know that off the top of my head.
It will be in Indianapolis.
Indianapolis, okay. So more of a Midwest town. And again, I do hit this home. I do believe geography does play somewhat of a role in this. And the reason I say that, and you know this, they have to take time out of their schedules, these messengers, these members of churches that have been deemed that will come on behalf of those SBC churches. That is not cheap. That is not easy. And we're talking about people having to potentially fly across country, at least half the country, sometimes taking time off of their own work schedule, taking their own vacation time. So this is something that plays a role. I think geographically there is a point to be made there. So it would be very interesting to see if that is completely adopted next year. Having said that, you mentioned something and alluded to it, and this is something I find very fascinating, and I want to spend some time on this with you for just a moment. Former President James Merritt who was accompanied by some other former presidents as well. So some very heavy-hitting individuals here: James Merritt, J.D. Greer, Steve Gaines, and Bryant Wright. I want to get those names correctly.
Yes.
Standing with Dr. Merritt, who's the one who was speaking on behalf of many there, proposed that a study committee be formed to figure out really what is friendly cooperation, and if there are other churches that are in violation of it, what should they do with them, and what is it that would violate friendly cooperation? Do you think that's a fair question?
Well, since it had previously been placed there, I think it's been about 10 years ago where this terminology was installed. The question is, why would you bring this up at this time? And it's obvious that it's corresponding to the amendment that was passed, and that they fully intended, and as J.D. Greer had already written a blog post, he has a problem, and you have to understand why they're doing it. They're doing it because they have a problem with this amendment outlining specifically who can own the role, the label of pastor.
Right.
And that's there would be no other reason to do this. So when you go into talking about friendly cooperation, are you trying to lessen the expectation that churches that are in friendly cooperation are abiding by these understandings of what a pastor is, and which goes along with the outline of the doctrines in the Baptist faith and message? That's the only explanation that I could give you of why that they would want to do this at this time. Because, and again, if you could go to J.D. Greer's most recent blog, where he outlines this, you see his concern, and I think that, again, I don't think that he sees the danger going the other way. And what we're discovering is how many churches already have senior pastors. And I know in comparison to 40,000 churches, it may not seem like a lot, but there are a considerable number of churches that now are in friendly cooperation who have females serving in that role.
Right.
Or on staff being called pastor of some sort.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to. And again, for all of the wording in his speech, I don't think Warren was off, Rick Warren, again, was off by much when he spoke about the thousands and thousands of churches that probably are right now currently under ordained, quote-unquote, female pastors. And his question was posed, are we basically going to disfellowship all these people, which it looks as if the convention is looking to do that. And then here these guys come trying to basically ask the question, well, what does friendly fellowship even mean, cooperation? I guess my question to you would be, do you think the convention is prepared to disfellowship that number of people?
I think it depends upon who we would be talking about. Do they have the wherewithal to do that? Some would, some would not. And I think the men that you mentioned, I think there's a lot of younger men that just some things that I've seen them say, they are reluctant. And there are younger men that also have strong convictions, and Mike Law is among them. So this thing is going to be hashed out.
Yeah.
And it has to be. It's, some people don't like this kind of thing. The church should be in unity, and we should just get along, go along, and get along. But if you don't deal with these things, it's going to come back to bite you.
That's a good point.
What happened before in the conservative resurgence is there were a lot of churches that were of the persuasion, or a considerable minority, we'll say, who thought that women should be in this role. But it also reflected their theology about the inerrancy of Scripture and their understanding of those things. It all was connected.
Right.
It came right down to it. Just as Warren's theology and his hermeneutics are changing, it goes hand in hand, and you can't ignore it. You ignore it to your own peril.
Yeah.
Because if we're going to do this, then who are we going to send? Who are we sending into the mission field? Who are we sending to go to the nations to make disciples of all nations? Because if we fail here, we'll fail there.
Yeah.
If we're not clear on how we together understand these things, it has to be dealt with. And I feel like Al Mohler sees the concern. Just one among leaders that has
Sure.
has made some clear comments from this convention and the last. So, but that's where things are right now.
I want to get your thoughts on another issue that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I would almost dare blame my generation for this, but the lingo of the word pastor itself and that office being thrown around so lightly in churches to the point every office or every position anymore is referred to as pastor. You can get from pastor of children's ministry, pastor of nursery, pastor of fellowship. Do you think that's something that needs to be addressed, and we need to really drive home the fact that we're talking about one office here and not a multitude of offices?
It's a good point. We have to go to the Scriptures, don't we?
Yeah.
We have to just read the Scriptures as they are and not add our own slots, our own positions. And it's very serious what the Scriptures say about this role. And I could just begin reading in chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, verse 1. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. And we can interchange overseer for bishop in some translations, elder. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? If I read that eliminates quite a few of these newer innovations that we hear.
Sure.
And I think that earlier on in my ministry, even I may have been, I didn't see how subtle that is, in that lessening of the role by giving these titles to people that haven't been called to do this.
Right.
And haven't been set aside by the church to do this, and hands laid on them and prayed over them, and recognizing they're being set apart for this serious purpose. And I think it's a concern.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think that is something that'll probably have to be hashed out. And I, frankly, not just within the SBC. I see that in a lot of other churches as well, and I think it's something to pay close attention to. The wording itself, I think, probably needs to be addressed. I'll be interested to see if that study committee brings that up as well, because I do think, right, wrong, and different, what people think about that. I think it would be healthy if that was involved in that study, because I think it's something that really needs to be looked into. Just the sheer volume of people taking that terminology And again, maybe that would help clarify some things in some churches that many people see that going on in. Who knows? That's another day and another topic perhaps. But just some final closing thoughts here. Any other issues or future considerations? I know we had talked about a little bit about Lifeway. Did you want to touch on that briefly about some of the things that came out? Really, what is Lifeway and what came about there, and maybe the convention that was a little interesting and got some people in hot water, perhaps?
Well, Lifeway is the publishing arm
Right.
Of the convention. We mentioned earlier, it used to be called the Sunday School Board, and those materials have been relied upon by Southern Baptists for generations. Sometimes they've been good, sometimes they've been not so good, depending upon who was in leadership in the convention in years past. Before the conservative resurgence, there was serious problems, which was part of the reason why change came about. But there's still those things that are published by them that they've been money makers. That's the only way we could describe it. And I know that we've been say your name, Beth Moore. People
Right.
like Beth Moore who have that personality and that draw that people want their materials. Even though she deals, and we could just be honest, and I know some women, they say, well, I've been helped by Beth Moore, but I have to be honest about Beth Moore. Beth Moore deals in what we call eisegesis, not exegesis. And she's always been consistent in that. And eisegesis meaning that she imposes things upon the text rather than pulling from the text consistently in her teaching. And she also has presented herself in many ways as a preacher. And all of that is problematic. That's just one example. I think that some of the materials have improved through the years. But there's always those on the floor, and I think I know what you're talking about at the convention when some questions get brought up from the floor, and you never know what somebody's going to say.
Right.
And I think some people look forward to these segments when the president of Lifeway gets up, and he's a newer guy he was a pastor out in Colorado. He's taking questions, and a guy gets up and basically says something like he thinks that all Lifeway material is trash. But he didn't say it like that, but it really came out that way. And I don't know that that's helpful. I mean, you might think that, but that really doesn't aim. When are you going to stop doing, producing those kinds of things? And he got really defensive on that and about Beth Moore and asked the gentleman, I don't know, was this gentleman or another gentleman, said, have you read Beth Moore's latest book, which is a kind of a autobiography?
Right.
Which I thought was strange, that in this setting that you would really aim things that way. So he aimed things back at the person and I think was really kind of presenting Beth Moore as the victim in saying that. But it was an awkward moment. Yeah. One of several awkward moments. So you could just take that for what it is. It really wasn't. It didn't seem like a productive segment. The things that were said there.
Right. The reason I brought it up is, again, I thought it flowed into the whole role again in churches, and then if they're going to disfellowship, basically, with churches, I understand the gentleman's question, maybe a little harsh, but then how far do we take it when we talk about publishing these individuals who do, frankly, claim to be ministers? As a matter of fact, Beth Moore has left the SBC. For those that don't know that, has completely disassociated herself. So it was an interesting discussion back and forth. And for those that don't know, you can listen to that online if you'd like to look that video up. I want to circle back real quick, just kind of closing out here on some final issues and considerations. Back to geography. This got brought up a lot. I was fascinated by this, particularly as a social studies teacher and knowing how far we've come in voting in America and really in other places in the world. This is not just an American concept. But the idea of remote voting or live voting. That is not something the SBC practices. You and I had corresponded a little bit, and both were talking about the fact that we were watching the SBC annual meeting, and yet, although I'm not in the SBC particularly, you were not able to vote, though, even though you were watching and staying up to date, because that is something they've not allowed. Do you think that is something that will be implemented in the future? And maybe a follow-up question to that, do you think there should be something done about the meeting locations themselves?
Well, what was interesting is that this past convention was originally supposed to be in Charlotte,
Right.
but apparently there were some issues logistically that they made. I don't know if it was the venue that they didn't have enough to house the number, so they had to change it to New Orleans. So sometimes there's those venue issues that when you're talking about conference centers, whether it's big enough. So that's a continuing challenge in itself. I've heard remote voting come up through the years, and the argument against it is usually that we vote in person, we keep things as a body in person, and just like you do in your local church, we wouldn't have a business meeting where people could vote by proxy. When you start doing that just opens the door for a lot of shenanigans, or people not being fully aware of why you're voting, right? You're there in person in the moment, and whether that's possible to replicate that through having this in different venues. But I think the other side of it, I think, Jeremiah, you have an excellent point, because how many pastors just can't do this, or even average church members can't do this. This would be their vacation.
Right.
This would be the money that they would take their family somewhere. And some people do make it a vacation. They kind of replicate things. And the cost of going to the convention for the average person or average pastor is very expensive. And you think of some that are bivocational even, and the time that the opportunity to be able to even go. I think that a lot more people would like to be engaged. So I think there could be a possibility that maybe some kind of remote voting is implemented in the future, that there would be some visionary leadership to where that it could still be something that's authentic enough, because it's not the local church, right? We're not, the convention is not the local church,
Right.
but if you could replicate something that's authentic enough that everybody's on the same page, and then those remote venues across the country, maybe four venues or something like that, I think it'd be worth a study. Speaking of studies, when they have a study, I want they do a study on that to get more people engaged in the decision-making process.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
That would be worth a study.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. And
Yeah.
another one I want to throw out to you before we close out here, we talked about, that they're going to be looking at churches that are deemed not in friendly cooperation and what that means. And I think over the last few years, as we mentioned at the top of the episode, there have been some churches, very conservative churches, that have been leaving the SBC and becoming independent or in other networks
Yes.
and organizations. Yeah, the flip side of that would be, do you think that there will be left-leaning churches leave now because they feel that maybe they're threatened and their theological stance here is in limbo? Do you see that potentially happening for the SBC? And if so, what does that mean for the seminaries and the North American Mission Board in general?
Well, it does seem like on either side of the spectrum that there may be some churches kind of waiting things out to see what develops. And, there's a baton being passed slowly to the next generation.
Yeah.
And dependent upon who's in leadership will determine that. And so I think it's worth our prayers, because, the SBC has a lot of influence. They train, and those 6 seminaries train so many ministers that go out across this country, and so many missionaries. The largest missionary sending organization in the world, the International Mission Board. You know, there are churches that could leave on either end. The conservative, if things become more, we'll call it liberal, or, you know, more compromise. And there have been, I think you mentioned that.
Right.
There have been some that we know have left. And I would just encourage those that are thinking about that to wait and be engaged and, you know, for the next generation, because these institutions, and this was something that we really wanted to get in, Jeremiah, these institutions that have been built up, you have to understand, when they're lost, they're gone.
Yeah.
It's just like I walked through a college campus a day ago. I won't mention which one. And I saw plaques, historic plaques that had been removed and replaced with woke explanations of history, and a rainbow flag flying on this campus, and it made me think, well, that's what you could give away someday, right?
Right.
Just like what happened to Princeton and many other colleges across the country,
Yeah.
and seminaries. So, is it worth hanging on to try to direct things in a more conservative, faithful, biblical direction? That's the question that every church is going to have to make a decision on. You know, and count the cost. You know, whether it's worth it. It seems like it would be worth it at this point to do that or to consider it.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting moving forward, how churches handle this, how the SBC navigates these waters, the outcomes of these study groups, and ultimately, like the voting next year on the amendments and other facets of the SBC. Travis, brother, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for your insight and for your wisdom. I know you really pay attention to these things, and I appreciate that. You've done your homework. Help us out here a little bit. If people are in the Roanoke, Salem area, up near the Star, as they say, how can they get in touch with Crystal Spring Baptist Church and times of service and help those guys out that might be looking for a local church there?
Well, you can check out, look for Crystal Spring Baptist Church online in the Roanoke, Virginia area. And, you know, you can also find us on social media on Facebook. And we'd love to have you contact us, and love to reach back out at you. You could those would be the two main ways. You look for our website, and you'll see a lot of our contact information on there in Roanoke, Virginia, Crystal Spring Baptist Church, and we'd love to connect with you.
Yeah, can't recommend these guys enough. If you want to find Travis online, he's got a Facebook page there. You can add him there, or you can find him. He's at Travis_Hilton on Twitter. So if you'd like to follow him on there, and I know it'd be a really good one for you, and connect with him that way. As a matter of fact, that's how Travis and I connected, was through Twitter. So if you want to find me, you can find me on there as well on Facebook. If you haven't done so already, check out our Deeply Rooted podcast page as well on Facebook. You can join that there. And you can also make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave us a review on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts. That would help us out greatly. You can also find us on our website. That's deeplyrootedpodcast.com. That'll take you, if you want to go back and look at the archived episodes, that'll run you right to our YouTube channel. And you can also find our blog post on there and our upcoming ministry schedule. Speaking of that, real quick plug, Deeply Rooted Conference, November 10th and 11th this year, Kingsport, Tennessee. Really excited about that, looking at the doctrine of assurance. So if you'll head on over to deeplyrootedpodcast.com, you can go ahead and register for that. Rates are going to be really low through the month of June. After June, we're going to have to kick those up just a slight bit. So try to get on there and register early if you can. Anybody under 18 is going to be getting in for free. We just ask that you register on there. So this is open to anybody and everybody. This is not just for ministers, so bring your family. Should be a great time. Brother Mike Abendroth going to be coming in from Massachusetts, so we're excited about him. He'll be leading most of the main sessions there for us, but we will have breakouts. A lot of local pastors going to be speaking. Really, really looking forward to the fellowship and time together. We had a great time last year, and so this year should be just as good as well. And so, again, that's going to be Kingsport, Tennessee. Looking forward to that November 10th and 11th coming up just around the corner this fall. So head on over, subscribe, and then make sure you find yourself over there on the website and register for the conference. So that being said, I think I got all the commercials out of the way there, Travis. But, brother, again, appreciate you being on. Thank you so much for round 2 for us here on your second appearance for the Deeply Rooted podcast.
Great to be with you, Jeremiah.
Hey, love you guys. Yeah, appreciate it. And we hope you all have a great week in Jesus.